Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're going to get started soon. We are waiting for people to join us. We're going to give it a couple minutes, and then we will get started. So give us a couple, like 5 minutes. We'll get started. Thank you for joining us for our 2021 Environmental Justice Legislation meeting. And why do we need it? We're going to dive into why we need this legislation. We'll get started at 12:05 as people are joining us as well. Welcome to everybody. People are rolling in, and we'll get started soon. Okay, thank you for joining us. We've got a great lineup of speakers for today as well. I know we've got lots of folks joining us today, so we'll get started in one more minute. Thank you for being here. Chat and video are disabled for this meeting for the time being, and we'll have it up soon for you all in a little bit. We'll get started. Okay, so we are going to get started. Thank you for joining us today for our 2021 Environmental Justice Legislation. Why do we need it meeting? Thank you for joining us. And I want to start us off by having a land acknowledgement. So at Beyond Toxics, we do a land acknowledgement again to acknowledge which land we are on, especially for us doing this work here, this environmental justice work. So our land acknowledgement, we respectfully acknowledge that the Eugene Beyond Toxics office is on Kalapuya Ilahi, the homelands of the Kalapuya people. This land is still occupied by descendants of the First Nations of the Willamette Valley. We are honored to share the land and have a part in safekeeping the resources for future generations. While we are guests in their home, we set our intentions to care for the land, its waters, its airs, and protect the gifts of these lands. And we are committed to respecting the rights, traditions, and knowledge of the Kalapuya people. And our setup for today, as you're joining us, your audio and your video is turned off. For the time being, we do have some presentations for you and some speakers. And so we have disabled the video and chat function for this first half. We will enable that at the later half when we have our Q&A. And you can always check out participants and things like that. So just wanted to give you a heads up as you're joining us that those functions are disabled for you for the time being, and we will turn them back on in a little bit. So now that before we get started, my name is Anna Molina. I work with Beyond Toxics here as a statewide environmental justice projects manager. And we are going to be talking to you a little bit today, if it's new to you, about our environmental justice and climate justice legislation. This legislation is being proposed by Beyond Toxics, the NAACP, and the NAACP Eugene, Springfield and Portland branches. We are moving this important environmental and climate justice legislation as well. And the two legislation pieces that we're moving are SCR 17, the Environmental Justice for Oregon, a concurrent resolution. This establishes an EJ framework of principles for the state of Oregon. And HB 2488, Equity in Climate and Land Use, amends statewide land use planning goals to address climate equity and environmental justice. And why do we need this legislation? The needs of vulnerable communities must be centered as Oregon addresses the challenge of intensifying climate and environmental impacts. And so we have this legislation is supported by a broad group of environmental justice organizations, racial justice organizations, and environmental organizations. As you can see the list here, we've got the Democratic Party of Oregon's Environmental Caucus, Verde, Opal, Climate Solutions, and who are all supporting this legislation in this 2021 session. And next, I'm gonna move over. Our next speaker is Haley Case Scott. I'll let her introduce herself. She's an employee with Beyond Toxics and NAACP, and she's going to talk a little bit more about the environmental justice resolution.
Cool. Thank you so much, Anna. Happy to speak today. I'm going to be talking about our environmental justice concurrent resolution, and so I'm just going to provide a little background about it and why we're doing it. And so that we know that Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities are disproportionately impacted by climate change and environmental injustices. And so for one example, the wildfires in September 2020 impacted communities that were already among our most vulnerable and underserved. And it is clear that we need environmental justice framework or principles for the Oregon Joint Resolution right now. And although the resolution, it's not legally binding, it sets forth a foundation of principles that establishes a commitment by the legislature to follow environmental justice principles in future lawmaking. And this joint resolution, it's really a platform and a promise to future generations that frontline communities will no longer be invisible and discounted in decision-making processes. And so this resolution that we're bringing forth, it affirms that clean air and water, healthy food, and a stable climate are basic human rights. It recognizes that frontline impacted and traditionally underrepresented communities have lacked adequate services and infrastructure, which has made those communities more vulnerable to environmental and public health impacts. And it also ensures that historically disadvantaged communities are represented in the decision-making process. And so our current sponsors right now on the Senate, we have Senator Dembro as our chief sponsor. We also have support from Senator Riley, Senator Manning, Senator Golden, Senator Jama. And then on the House side, our chief sponsor is Representative Power. We also have the support from Representative Alonso Leon, Representative Pham, Representative Lively, Representative Wilde, Representative Dexter, Representative Hudson, Representative Meek, and Representative Neron. And so I really wanted to outline those supporters because I'm really excited about it, and it shows how much we need to get this passed. So thank you so much. And I think now I'm going to pass it on to my colleague Danny to talk about our House Bill 2488. Thank you.
Yes, hi everyone. My name's Danny. I'm the Legislative Affairs Manager at Beyond Toxics. And as Haley mentioned, I'm going to give a update on House Bill 2488, Equity and Climate in Land Use. The bill was introduced back in January, and chief sponsors on the House side are Representatives Power and Helm. And the bill called in broad terms for DLCD, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, to amend or create new land use planning goals to address climate change, equity, and environmental justice. And for anyone who's taken a look at the bill, it's quite a lengthy bill, quite a lot of detail in there. And what we've been doing over the last few months is trying to work on what's called a -1 amendment to this bill. And so that's a bill, an amendment being made in committee, and we're working very closely with the bill's chief sponsors, the chair of the Environment and Energy Committee, Representative Marsh, as well as the Department of Land Conservation and Development and the Governor's Office. And so what our objectives for this amendment were sort of collectively was to take what was a sort of very broad bill with a lot of detail and content and directives in it, and try and streamline that bill in a way that would allow it to be implemented by the department in the 2021 biennium, and within the budget allocation that the governor has recommended go to DLCD for this work, to align the goals and process and work of this bill with the $800,000 directed to DLCD in the governor's recommended budget. And so over the last few months, we've been speaking. We've had a number of meetings with both the agency and the governor's office and a number of other stakeholders about the first version of this bill. And yeah, that was basically the common theme, was that we needed to get as much of this work done within this biennium as we could, and then we needed to do it within budget. So I think we're very close to sort of finalizing that amendment, and I think we're going to end up with an amended bill that still achieves the goals that we had set out for this piece of legislation, but does so in a way that maximizes its chances of being passed. And so I'm just going to walk quickly through a few of the key changes to the bill from the text of the bill as introduced to what we think we'll see out of this -1 amendment. And so the main structural change to the bill is that instead of there being a broad mandate and direction to DLCD to review all of the existing land use planning goals, all 19 of them, and then to make a decision as to which of those goals should be amended and whether there needs to be any new goals, at least one or more, to address climate equity and environmental justice. There's now a much simpler mandate that DLCD adopt a single new goal, a goal 20, that addresses all three of these objectives at the same time, of climate equity and environmental justice. And so that's the sort of high level change. And then what that has also meant is that we've tried to get more specific in terms of what land use decisions by local governments this new goal 20 will apply to, and what will be required in respect of those land use decisions. And so to give a couple examples, on the climate change side of things, what we're talking about with this new goal 20 is a requirement for local governments when they amend or update their comprehensive plans, that they need to do so, and that in that process they need to be able to address climate change mitigation and adaptation and sequestration of storage and greenhouse gases, that there needs to be some component of that comprehensive plan that speaks to the need to reduce emissions, to adapt to climate change impacts, to protect lands that sequester and store greenhouse gases, those sorts of things. There's also a requirement for local governments when making decisions about urban growth boundaries, and I guess this applies mostly to cities, and the selection of urban and rural reserves, that they need to consider the sort of emissions that are gained or lost in expanding a city into certain types of land. And also whether there's any sort of impact on the carbon storage that was occurring in the land that's now earmarked for urban growth. So those are the kinds of decisions that the climate sort of criteria will apply to. And then on the equity and public participation side, the changes here aren't, I guess, quite as dramatic. I mean, it was originally envisioned in the bill as introduced that we would sort of be amending goal 1 and sort of taking goal 1 on. But we're sort of, what we're looking to do with goal 20 is to sort of achieve the outcomes that we're hoping to see through an amended goal 1 in goal 20. So in order to comply with goal 20, local governments will be required to ensure that they have policies and procedures in place for equitable public participation, that they're using some kind of mapping tool or sort of analysis instrument to identify disparate impacts in their local government area in terms of environmental health risks, and that they are taking steps in their land use decision making to address and remediate those impacts. So in that sense, the outcomes we want to see on the equity and environmental justice side are very similar to what we were going for in the bill as introduced. So those are the big substantive changes. In terms of timelines, the language, the text of the new Goal 20, what's called the goal text, in line with sort of our priority imperative that we complete this within the biennium, we want to have that new goal adopted by the end of June 2023, which is a much quicker timeline than was envisioned in the original House Bill 2488 text, which I think was sort of looking at completion around 2025. And so the objective here is to sort of finalize the goal text and then leave sort of the task of implementation and the kind of funding and resources that will be needed to assist local governments to the next biennium and to the next budget for that biennium. And so compliance, accordingly, compliance for local governments with this new Goal 20 is sort of rolled out on a sort of tiered process. There'll be tiered implementation. And so what this means is that the largest cities and counties will be required by June 30, 2025 to comply with Goal 20, and then 1 year later, mid-sized cities and counties will be required to comply, and then the smaller city and counties in Oregon will be required to comply another 12 months after that. I will note, it's a little bit of a technical point, but we are talking about whether there needs to be compliance for cities with a population under 2,500 with the climate obligations in Goal 20. We would still require them to comply with the equity and environmental justice directives, but we're sort of leaning towards making that sort of an opt-in process for those governments, particularly because the sort of comprehensive plan work is quite onerous. And finally, I'll just mention two components of the original bill that are remaining in there, or rather one component, which is the advisory committee. In the original bill, it was called the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. We're now just going to make that a rulemaking advisory committee with significant representation of individuals with knowledge and expertise in environmental justice issues. And then the last thing I'll cover is that there's going to be a new directive in the amended bill for the Department of Land Conservation and Development to coordinate with other agencies, and for other agencies to coordinate with it in order to ensure that the Goal 20 is developed and implemented in as effective a way as possible. And so, yeah, that's a summary of where we're at. I think we can expect the text of this amended bill to be introduced in the next couple of weeks, and anticipating a hearing in early March. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny, for giving us an overview of the changes to HB 2488. Really appreciate it. I know it's something new for some folks here on the call. And within our further presentations, we'll get into a little bit more of like, what do these changes look like as well. So lastly, for this portion, before we move into the rest of our speakers, is we've gotten a lot of questions as well of like, why a resolution, and why did we decide to go with SCR 17? And a resolution, as you can see, is introduced in either the House of Representatives or the Senate, and it's limited in effect to Congress or one of its chambers. There's 3 different types of resolutions. There's a joint resolution, simple resolutions, and concurrent resolutions. Ours is a concurrent resolution, meaning that it's being brought up in both like the Senate and the House to be supported there. And then why we're choosing to go with the resolution is that we know we're in a divided legislature right now, as we've seen with past walkouts from our Senate. And we hope that this resolution, SCR 17, creates deeper conversations for our legislators, and it sets the stage for current and future environmental justice legislation that we really need. And that hopefully by adopting this resolution, the legislative branch can adopt future EJ environmental justice legislation and climate equity as their own standard of conduct for judging future legislation. So that's why we decided to go with a resolution this session for SCR 17 as well. And we'll be sharing a link to where you can find the full resolution and one-pagers in a bit as well. So next we're going to have Jonathan Harker. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for us right now. And we're going to move into Jonathan Harker, who's going to be talking to us a little bit more about land use and why we need change in our land use planning as well. Hi, Jonathan.
So good afternoon. I've been asked to talk about my experience as a local planner in implementing statewide planning goals. So I'll talk a little bit about my background. I'm a retired city planner, having worked for the city of Gresham from the mid 2010s or to the from the mid 1980s to the mid 2010s. In my career at Gresham, I served as a comprehensive planning project manager, as a comprehensive planning division manager, and at retirement, I was the planning director. I have a master's degree of urban and regional planning from Portland State University. I also want to mention that I've been working with the project team around House Bill 2488 as a representative of the Oregon chapter of the American Planning Association, which has endorsed the legislation. So let's see. Oh, I'm sorry, this So I wanted to, that the agenda for my presentation is to provide a short history of statewide land use planning, to describe what is a comprehensive plan, to go over two Gresham sort of case studies, and then to talk about some takeaway and why this needs reforming. So the title of my presentation, I guess, again, is why this needs reforming. So, it's 1970, and the history books tell us that Oregonians were concerned about the impact that unregulated development was having on landscapes that Oregons treasured. Forest and agricultural land, natural resource lands, recreation lands, and coastal lands. In the words of then Governor Tom McCall, there was the threat of sagebrush subdivisions and coastal condomania. This led in 1973 to the passage of Senate Bill 100, or legislation to establish a statewide land use planning program. That legislation created a new department, Department of Land Conservation and Development, DLCD, a new commission, Land Conservation and Development Commission, LDC, and then charged LDC with adopting some new statewide land use planning goals. It also provided that local governments would have to adapt and implement those in their comprehensive plans that would be consistent with those statewide land use planning goals. It also provided that LCDC over time could revise the adopted goals and add new goals. In 1975 and 1978, 19 goals were adopted. There's going to be somebody else later in this presentation, today that will be talking about the goals. So I'm not going to go over them in any detail. I just wanted to note that there were like 5 general themes: planning for people, protecting farm and forest lands, managing urban and rural development, protecting natural resources, and managing the coast and ocean resources. You will also note there was no climate change response or climate justice goal, as that wasn't a conversation then. So it's 1920, now it's 2021. We've had no new goals adopted since 1978. Some of the goals have been amended, but not all. Only a handful of the goals have been amended in the past 20 years, and only one in the last decade. None of these amendments were to address climate change or social justice or environmental climate justice. So the adoption of the new goals set into a process where local jurisdictions, including Gresham, had to begin developing comprehensive plans. In 1978, Gresham completed that work of adopting a comprehensive plan that were consistent with the goals. And over the past 40 years, then they've amended the plan to respond to goal amendments, state legislation, and changing local conditions. So again, I'm not going to talk about all the goals. I'm going to talk about two process goals first, because these are important to the work of HB 2488, I believe. The first is the goal 1, this idea of developing a citizen involvement program that ensures the opportunity for citizens to be involved in all phases of the planning process. And we're going to see as we talk about this, the case studies, that this hasn't happened in terms of all people being involved in the planning process. Second, the goal 2 established that there would be this comprehensive planning process, and that would be a framework for all land use decisions and actions related to land use, and that there be a factual base for decisions and actions. Sorry, I found out that my Mac doesn't work real well with making presentations on Zoom here. On the goal 2 process, I guess I skipped a part, but there's this idea of having factual information. I'll talk about that a bit more, but think about, for the moment, think about how difficult it's going to be to make decisions in response to climate change or decisions in response to climate justice if we don't have an understanding of the facts that are behind and making our decision making. So now I'm going to talk about, I'll just briefly go over what a comprehensive plan is. In the statutes, the official document adopted by the city or county, which sets forth the general long-range policies for a community's future development. They have to address the planning goals. They anticipate and provide for future land use for 20 years. They include the elements in the goals, and then they have implementing measures that both comply with the statewide goals and are consistent with the policies that they've adopted. So I'll talk about two case studies for Gresham. And this first one addresses goal 10. Goal 10 is to provide for the housing needs of citizens of the state. This amendment, this goal was one of the ones adopted in 1975. And when it was adopted, it told jurisdictions that they needed to create what was called a buildable lands inventory. That was to take a look at what lands could be available for residential land and then plan for the needs based on sort of the price and rent ranges that could be available to the people, to their kind of the needs of the households, both for the now and for the future. So this is an example of what happens when a goal is amended. In 1988, it was amended to require the larger communities, such as Gresham, to include manufactured housing as a needed housing type. So this is one of the earliest projects that I worked in my career at Gresham. So when you think about a manufactured home, it's not a trailer. It's not a manufactured, like a trailer that you put on a thing. And it's kind of an alternative to what would conventionally be called a stick-built house that you would build on site. Instead, it's a home, it's a house that's manufactured off-site and then delivered to the site and put on a foundation. So Gresham did an analysis. That's just sort of looking at the facts. What kind of available land do we have? What kind of projections for demographic population, household needs? What kind of households were there going to be? And how did that relate to affordability? Gresham did determine that that was a needed housing type. It provided for a new policy. It also provided some new code that would allow a manufactured house, a manufactured home on any single family lot. It also created a process for a manufactured home subdivision in a specific multi-family district. So I wanted to point out that this would not have been done if the state hadn't provided a mandate to do it. And I also want to point out that this was the late 1980s, and it was done with minimal public participation. And there was no looking at really what the impacts might be to this to typically underrepresented communities. So this next project is a much more recent project, 2011. And this sort of addresses goal 13, to conserve energy. In 2011, state legislation was passed that required all jurisdictions to allow rooftop solar panels on an outdoor as an outright use. This meant that I think the legislation was passed because some jurisdictions, somebody would come in and say, hey, could I put up a rooftop solar panel? And they had no provisions for it, so they would say no. So this legislation was passed, but it did provide an exception that said you did not have to require someone to, a jurisdiction to permit a rooftop solar panel if it was on a historic structure. So at that point, I was the department's planning director. And I thought, well, this is not a decision that we should make just by staff. This needed to be a public process to determine whether or not we wanted to apply that exception or not. And I also understood that our goal 13, the one that talks about conserving energy, was out of date. The goal 13 was adopted in 1975. This is one that's never been amended. Goal 13 itself mentions renewable energy, but does not have any requirements that jurisdictions do anything about renewable energies. Gresham's comprehensive plan for that goal was last updated in the mid-1980s, and it mentions solar and wind, not any other form of renewable energy, and there was no implementing code. So it sort of means that if you were someone who wanted to build a renewable energy facility, small, medium, or large, we had no provisions for you to do that. We hadn't thought about what the context of renewable energy should be in our community. So we decided to do a project, the council decided to do a project to update the comprehensive plan and development code to address renewable energy systems, solar and wind, but also geothermal, microhydrology. And we went about doing a project. And as we do projects, we look and see, well, what are other jurisdictions doing in the subject matter? And what we found is in Oregon, there was really nobody looking at or had looked at renewable energy and how it might fit into their communities. So Gresham went ahead and added a plan policy for renewable energies and then code language to allow renewable energies sort of depending on their size and the land use district that they were going to be permitted in. So one of the things I wanted to point out is that this kind of points out the need to align the statewide planning program to climate by adding a climate response goal. This was done with a little bit better public participation, a little bit more inclusive, but it's still, again, not really thought about. We weren't really thinking about being deliberate about who would participate, especially from underrepresented communities, or what the impact might be to underrepresented impact communities. So I'm going to sort of wrap up here then with some takeaways, and why House Bill 2488 is needed. Climate change response is not mentioned or addressed in the goals. As I talked about, it wasn't part of the adopted goals. It's never, there's been no goal adopted, nor have any of the amendments that have been done to the goals talk about climate change or climate change response. There's a lack of data on how vulnerable communities are impacted by climate change and climate justice. So there needs to be clear direction for jurisdictions and assistance for jurisdictions to be able to have that data to understand the impact of the land use decisions. Again, the planning and land use decisions are based on the current planning goals, and the things what jurisdictions have or what are based on the current planning goals, and so they lack criteria to avoid climate impacts. Finally, that the required public engagement in land use planning does not address historically underrepresented communities. And I have a quote here, or direct language from the goal. It says that the program for citizen involvement shall include an officially recognized committee for citizen involvement, broadly representative of geographic areas and interests related to land use and land use decisions. What that means is based on statewide planning goals, jurisdictions are including geographic areas and people who are interested in land use decisions. You can see that really leaves out of the conversation many communities. And I can tell you from my experience in Gresham that typically who's involved in the plan use processes by the institutional impact are those who historically have been power, the sort of white homeowners. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. And I'll stop sharing if I can get my screen to work.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Maybe you can go ahead and stop my sharing. Oh, there, I got it.
Yes, thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Jonathan, for sharing information about our land use system and who is impacted by it. And next we have Amy Okotie-Oyekan. She works at the NAACP at the Environmental and Climate Justice Program. And she's going to be giving us a presentation about environmental justice and land use. And so how has our land use really impacted Black, Indigenous people of color? So next we have Amy, if we can spotlight her, and she's going to give us a presentation.
Thank you, Anna. Let me share my screen. Okay, everyone should be able to see that. So hi, everyone. I've been invited to come talk a little bit about where land use meets environmental justice. My name is M.A. Okotie-Oyekan. I'm the Environmental and Climate Justice Coordinator for the NAACP Eugene Springfield unit. And I'm also a graduate student at the University of Oregon studying environmental studies and community and regional planning. And so I've really only been at this work for the past about three and a half years. And I have a background in the natural sciences. My undergrad is in biology. And so it was kind of really organic that I began making the connections between environmental change and the proliferation of climate change and who was being impacted disproportionately by those changes. And so now a lot of my focus and work rests at the intersection of environment, race, and inequality. And so my contact information there at the bottom of the slide. And so the NAACP, they have a national environmental and climate justice program that started in 2009. And they released a toolkit called Our Communities, Our Power, that is essentially has a bunch of information and resources about how to organize for climate resilience in your communities. And they have several modules in that toolkit, and one of the modules was land use. So I'm pulling this quote from that module. Equitable land use planning and management practices are central to building community resilience to adapt to climate change. And so land use has just so much potential to for climate mitigation and adaptation, and also just building resilience and strength in our communities, you know, helping them be close to their works, to their workplaces and recreational amenities, not putting them in the path of flood zones or hurricanes or fire-prone areas. But that has not historically happened. And historically, our land use and development practices have been reckless and irresponsible and inequitable, has favored wealthy white property owners and development interests at the expense of low-income communities of colors. And this has created environmental, public health, and social inequalities, disparities in these communities that make them more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So essentially, land use has a direct connection to how communities feel and experience climate hazards. And these patterns of land use, you know, we can draw them through time, all the way back to Native American land dispossession here in North America. Let me speed this up for you all. And so, you know, we know that Native Americans were here first in this country, and they had their own very unique ways of managing the land, and they're very in tune with it. And so the arrival of European settlers brought in new values, new life ways, new patterns of human environmental relationships, new ways to manage the land that were in conflict with the way that Native Americans did. And so this whole concept of settler colonialism coming in and disrupting the societies, the human environmental relationships and patterns that are existing, and replacing them with something new, essentially became the basis of our land use patterns here in America. And so all this is to say that planning is inherently a very value-laden field. You know, as a planning student, we learn about the rational planning model, this framework that takes you through this objective pathway of decision making. So you come to the most effective and objective means to an end. But it's not so. You know, like I said, planning is very value laden, and those who have the power and resources to control what our built and natural environment look like, they hold certain values about what society should be. And those values essentially become imprinted and embedded in our natural and built environments. We can also talk about the very first zoning ordinance passed in America. It was passed in 1916 in New York. And it placed restrictions on the heights and densities of buildings to protect the value of existing real estate that belong to upper class residents, and protect those properties from undesirable invasions. Essentially, they didn't want the poor working immigrant class people from settling in these wealthier areas. So again, you see planning, zoning being used as a tool of social control, used to discriminate and exclude certain groups. Again, on exclusion and access, many of you may already know this, but Oregon was the only state admitted into the Union with an exclusionary clause in its constitution, in the state constitution, that forbade Black people from settling in the state. We could not live here or hold property. We're essentially illegal. It was illegal to be Black in the state of Oregon. And so this, again, just setting the standard of controlling access to land, to space, and to resources. And this language, this exclusionary language, is not removed from Oregon's state constitution until 2001. We can talk also about redlining. This was a land use and marketing strategy that used race to determine what areas were desirable for investment, what areas received resources and funding, and later determined what areas were, what zip codes were eligible to receive home ownership loans. So these red areas on the map, they were where low-income Black and Brown communities lived, and redlining was institutionally recognized. It was legal, a means of spatially segregating communities based on race. And so even though this was outlawed, I think it was in 1968, the impacts of this spatial and market inequities are long lasting. And so we see today in redline areas, they have the least amount of single family homes. So these areas are denser, have higher densities. We'll talk about why that's important a bit later. They have lower amounts of economic mobility, and they're also literally hotter than non-redline areas by 13 degrees. So we see this really direct connection to climate vulnerability. We think about urban heat island effect, that urban areas, because of the concrete and the asphalt, they're hotter than surrounding areas. But if you're in an area that's literally hotter than the next neighborhood, you're going to be more susceptible to heat stress and heat related illnesses. So again, even though these practices are no longer institutionally upheld by law, the impacts of them are still very present. The next kind of mini case study is the Ferry Street community. If you live in Eugene, you may be familiar with Alton Baker Park. I like to go there a lot. It's a really beautiful, beautiful area right on the Willamette River. But in the early 1900s, laws forbade African Americans from living in Eugene city limits. So the Black communities lived across the river in what is now Alton Baker Park, which was outside of the city limits at the time. And so the city or the government wanted to build a transportation project, a bridge, the Ferry Street Bridge. And so they wielded this power of eminent domain, which is a constitutionally given power that the government can essentially seize private property and use it for another use, as long as they pay you. But they use this power to displace this community. and build this, the Ferry Street Bridge. Another potentially well-known example is the flooding of Vanport in 1948. So Black Americans were recruited to work in the city's shipyards, and there was a lack of housing. So they hastily constructed these public housing projects in a floodplain for these workers to live in. And so an example of irresponsible, inequitable land use practices, putting people where they're more vulnerable to environmental hazards. So lo and behold, the Columbia River flooded in 1948 and left 18,000 people homeless. Another eminent domain example, the raising of the city of Albina here in Oregon. Urban renewal was a period of time where cities destroyed areas that they determined as blighted, that were, decrepit, or the blighted is the term that they use. But they use that as justification to, destroy communities and put something new in its place. So again, using that power of eminent domain to destroy this community. And Albina was a thriving Black district that housed 73% of Portland's Black population at its height. And so the homes and businesses were destroyed here to create what is now the Memorial Coliseum and Interstate 5. And that's, really important, that the transportation project that's showing up again. Transportation projects, highways, they have gone straight through historically Black communities and destroying them, and making pathways making pathways for a mass out-migration from cities, from inner cities to the suburbs. And so this, again, just another example of eminent domain in this urban renewal project. So we talked a little bit about settler colonialism, that kind of coming in with something new and replacing something old. And if you know the definition of gentrification, it's the change in neighborhood character because of an influx of a wealthier population. And it's funny, those definitions sound eerily similar. And the thing with single family zoning, we talked about how redline areas are denser. So zoning arose in the early 1900s, and it was constitutionally upheld as a tool for cities to use to control for nuisance land uses and segregate land uses. So single family zoning arose as a very exclusionary practice. These are areas that are, detached single family homes, large lot sizes, and they're prioritized for white wealthier communities. And so Black communities were relegated to areas that had denser development and more commercial development. And so that was kind of America's war on density, in the mid 1900s. Now density is in, right? And people want to live where it's walkable, where there's, mixed use development. They're close to all these different, commercial retail offerings, whatever that may be. But those denser areas, like I said, are where low income Black and brown communities live. So we have this huge, influx of people wanting to live where walkable areas are. We have an increased demand for walkable and dense areas that leads to increase in property values and essentially gentrification and displacement. And so you see the change of the Black and African American percentage of total population between 1970 and 2010. And so just again, land use practices, determining who has access to space and resources. And a current day example, West Eugene is most of the area is zoned for heavy industrial use. That's this dark purple. And that's also where our Bethel and Song communities live. Majority Latinx, minority populated communities, elevated rates of childhood asthma, lack of access to educational resources, low socioeconomic status. So you see this spatial inequity on the map overlaid with these demographic indicators, the minority populated, the low income, and as well as the public health disparities, the asthma. So again, this spatial inequities being connected to environmental, public, and socioeconomic inequities. And so again, the justification for a lot of these development decisions was that, or at the time, was that, you know, this is good. This is what's best for the public good, best for the public welfare. With public welfare at the time, you know, meaning protecting and prioritizing property belonging to wealthy white people. And so this made sense at the time. It was rational, right? But like we said in the beginning of this presentation, what is painted as rational or objective are not so. And so a building is not just a building, a street is not just a street, a zoning ordinance is not just a zoning ordinance. And our physical environments are infused with, you know, the political and social contexts in which those physical environments are situated. So what does that mean for climate? That technical adaptation is not enough. We need social change. And you can think of it like, you know, an equation. There's inputs and outputs. And so racism, classism, exclusion that leaves Black, Brown, and low-income communities in sacrifice zones, suffering from socioeconomic instability, and in the path of the most heinous environmental and public health atrocities. They're on both sides of this equation. They're an input and an output. They were a requirement for climate change, and they're also an effect of climate change and output. And so it's basically a feedback loop. You know, if the outputs are in the inputs, it just keeps going round and round. So what there needs to be is a disruption, an interruption, or a paradigm shift, and changing the way we view our relationship to our environment, and integrating climate adaptation, mitigation, and resilience thinking and equity into our land use practices, where every land use and development decision is being framed by our responsibility to protect people and planet. And so our environmental justice legislation, two pieces of legislation, SCR 17 and House Bill 2488, are that paradigm shift. You know, we call for this dramatic shift in the way we go about land use planning and development. And if you look at the language in these bills, like Haley mentioned earlier, clean air and water, they're human rights, right? You know, what did Mike Brown say? He said, "I can't breathe." You know, not being able to breathe, you know, no one should be in the position where they can't breathe or they can't go about safely without it being a risk to their public health. And so this concurrent resolution calls for the recognition of all state agencies for the need to correct environmental injustices. No one is off the hook. Everyone is complicit. We want to improve public health and the overall well-being of our communities and make reparative investments in frontline communities. So, you know, no more Black Lives Matter murals or equity panels. You know, we need investments. We need resources and money being directed to the communities that have historically been denied it. And this is also that we can build this just, equitable, and resilient future to secure the health and well-being for all people. And again, with House Bill 2488, integrating climate adaptation, mitigation, and equity into land use. We call for, Danny explained earlier that we call for the mapping of disadvantaged communities and identifying, quantifying, and mapping their health risks posed to them by inequitable land use practices. So we need to know where they are and exactly, you know, how they are suffering so that we can appropriately direct resources in their direction. Also, you know, the meaningful participation of disadvantaged communities in land use planning and decision-making. For too long, planners have gone about planning for communities instead of planning with communities. You can trace this all the way back, you know, to the Berlin Conference. It divided up Africa, and not a single African was present, you know, at the table. But we're talking about Oregon here, and this is, you know, particularly relating to Native American tribes, including them in decision making, and you know, this is not just a check off an engagement box. You know, our priorities need to be included in your plans, and so this is really the only way we can achieve climate justice and reduce and mitigate these cumulative health risks to disadvantaged communities. And so that is all I have for you today. And I'll thank you for, you know, the opportunity to speak, and I'll pass it back to Anna.
Thank you, Amy, for that presentation and really highlighting how Black, Indigenous, and people of color have been harmed by land use and zoning and where they have been placed. And so next we're going to have a recorded presentation as well from Professor Rebecca Lewis. She is a professor at the University of Oregon, and so she's going to be talking a little bit more about climate change and how land use has contributed to climate change and how we can plan for better climate change mitigations. And then also at the end of her presentation, there will be some information as well of how HB 2488 can really help address those climate change impacts with zoning. And then that will wrap up our kind of like overview and presentations. This is just to really like give people context of why HB 2488 and SCR 17 are really needed. And then we'll have questions, we'll have room for question and answer. So please stick around and information on how people can engage. So I'm going to share my screen right now and pull up her recorded presentation. She couldn't be with us today due to a scheduling conflict.
Good afternoon. I'm Rebecca Lewis, and I'm an associate professor in planning, public policy, and management at the University of Oregon. Thank you for inviting me here today to talk with you about land use and climate change in the context of Oregon. I'm sorry I couldn't be here with you live, as I have a conflict with another event at the university today. My research focuses on land use policy and growth management, and specifically how land use policy, transportation policy, and climate change policy work together in order to achieve climate goals. So today I'm going to talk very briefly about land use planning in Oregon and the structure of our statewide planning program. Then I'm going to talk about how land use affects climate change and why land use is important for mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, as well as thinking about adaptation and preparing for natural disasters and the consequences of climate change. I'll give my assessment of how our current land use planning system hinders and advances climate goals, and close with some key takeaways and opportunities for change. Oregon is well renowned in the country for being one of the strongest states with a statewide planning program. Oregon relies on a structure that requires local comprehensive plans from all cities within the state, has state level review or acknowledgement of those plans. And these plans must address 19 statewide goals that I'll talk more about on the next slide. One of those goals relates to urban growth boundaries and urbanization. This is what Oregon is most well known for nationally in terms of planning. Every single one of our cities draws a line between farm and forest land and urban land and concentrates growth within urban growth boundaries. We also have a pretty advanced attempt at combining transportation and land use planning through the transportation planning rule and other, the goal 12 within the broader statewide goals. I'll talk more about that on the next slide. So Oregon has these 19 goals. I know this is a very text heavy. I'm sharing a PDF of these slides so you can check it out later on. The point I want to make here is there are 19 statewide goals that were adopted in the 1970s. Local governments plans must include the first 14 of these goals, every single local government in the state, while the last several goals, goals 15 through 19, are addressed in specific geographic areas. These goals address process of how we go about engaging the public. They address the comprehensive planning system and how we go about constructing comprehensive plans. They also address conservation in the realm of agriculture and forest lands and other sorts of natural areas, while thinking about development and making sure that we have adequate land for employment uses and housing within our urban growth boundaries. By relying on buildable lands inventories to make sure that we have enough land to meet those needs. Additionally, these urban growth boundaries are part of this broader system, goal 14, urbanization. And we think about the transportation aspects and transportation systems plan to try to coordinate transportation and land use. What you don't see listed here is a climate goal or an equity goal. These are things that have not been considered as statewide planning goals historically. And as I mentioned earlier, these original set of goals were adopted in the 1970s, the most recent being around 1975. So with that in mind, I want to turn to this conversation about how land use affects climate change. Land use can both help and hinder progress towards climate change. The left-hand side is thinking about things from an adaptation perspective. How vulnerable are we to natural hazards? Who is living in the areas that are at risk of natural hazards? The left-hand side is showing the wildfires that swept our state earlier last year in September of 2020. The right-hand side is showing the other side, the mitigation side of things. So this looks more at where we're growing and how densely we're growing, what types of mixed uses we allow within communities, how we use our regulatory system to get there. So on the right-hand side, the idea is how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions? The left-hand side is how do we make sure that we are not at risk of disasters and that we're not developing and building in areas that are at risk of disasters or permitting housing in those areas. There's really important equity dimensions to both of these things. Who has access to the neighborhoods on the right, who can afford to live in them. And there's important aspects of the graphic on the left, who is forced to live in communities that are subject to wildfire or flooding or other disasters that come with the effects of climate change. So Oregon has done some state level planning on some of these topics from a transportation perspective, and more recently, thinking about how that relates to local comprehensive planning. So the piece of legislation that is transportation specific is the statewide transportation strategy. One of the things embedded within the statewide transportation strategy is this notion of urban growth boundaries as an approach to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. The other two programs are newer. There's an interagency program called Every Mile Counts, reflected here, as well as a rulemaking process called Climate Friendly Equitable Communities, which is a rulemaking effort designed to think about how local governments are going to help reach the climate mitigation targets. So this slide will sort of give an assessment based on the research that's out there now on where we are with land use and climate change. How are we helping make progress towards greenhouse gas reduction goals? How are we protecting areas that are at risk of disaster or preventing development within those areas? And how is our land use system working in the opposite direction and increasing greenhouse gas emissions or allowing for development in areas that are at risk? So the left-hand side here is going to talk about the good, and then in a moment I'll show you what I see as the sort of areas of weakness or the bad. So we've done a really good job through goals 3 through 6 of preserving forests and agricultural areas and natural areas, providing some carbon sinks, particularly in the realm of forests. The statewide planning program has been shown through national research to increase residential density and reduce sprawl within urban growth boundaries through goal 14. The state has also gotten a lot of press recently for House Bill 2001, which requires that cities allow for duplexes and single family zones, and that larger cities also allow for triplexes and quadplexes, meaning that we're promoting diverse housing types, we're promoting density within our urban cores. There's also mandates for cities to look at reducing vehicle miles traveled from automobiles and to put measures in place to make progress there through Goal 12 in the transportation planning rule. And there's a consideration of hazard areas through Goal 7. But despite these sort of strong frameworks for planning, some of the outcomes have been less positive from both the hazards and transportation perspective. One part of this is that our effects of climate change are getting more aggressive. And so the areas that we used to designate as high hazard areas have expanded, and different areas that we never thought about as being at risk are now at risk. There's also just areas of weakness in how these laws are implemented at the local level through development codes. So goal 7 and 12 is getting at the weak outcomes on transportation. There's weak connection to transportation investments from a state level in terms of how we're thinking about funding multimodal transportation versus automobile-centric transportation. We also have issues with the siting of housing and hazardous areas. And we have an issue with this sort of disconnect between goal 12 and 14, transportation and urbanization. We've created a spatial mismatch between jobs and housing that is affordable to families. So we're forcing people to drive more because they can't afford housing that's in close proximity to work. And they're forced to drive instead of using transit or other modes of transportation. Relating back to these last two, which get at displacement and housing type. BIPOC communities in particular have seen the impacts of not building enough housing and of displacement and gentrification happening within our communities. We've also had a trend towards building predominantly single family housing within our communities. So we haven't moved towards increasing our residential density by building something other than single family housing. Despite some of these shortcomings so far, there are many opportunities for change. Some of these can exist within the current regulatory system around strengthening our regulations about where we allow housing, around allowing and encouraging diverse housing in neighborhoods that already have high accessibility and job opportunity. That's something that's a big focus of the Climate Friendly Equitable Communities RAC that's going on right now. There's also important ways that we should be shifting our transportation investments into multimodal transportation, into biking, walking, and transit instead of automobile-centric transportation. On the other orange there is thinking about zoning regulations and promoting dense 20-minute neighborhoods that allow for a mixture of uses that prevent the need to travel so far and build more complete communities. And finally, there's an opportunity for thinking more specifically about climate justice within our planning system. And that's where House Bill 2488 comes in. So there are some ways to think about doing this. We can think about embedding this into our statewide planning goals, adding a new goal, goal 20, to try to consider climate change as we think about broader planning. That can get articulated into our community's land use plans and our land development codes. One point I want to make is that it's really important to think about this in the long term through visioning and comprehensive plans, as well as in the short term of the type of development decisions we're approving at a local level, and how we rely on our land development code to approve those development decisions. So to close with some key takeaways, Oregon has a strong statewide planning framework that has shown to be effective at addressing some aspects of this intersection of land use and climate change, particularly in promoting density within our cities and considering hazards in transportation. But we need to go further to think about the intersection of these issues and think about the intersection of housing, land use, transportation, and climate change, and the equity implications and justice implications of these broad topics that are very interrelated. House Bill 2488 provides a strong mechanism for addressing the shortcomings that exist now and moving towards thinking more comprehensively about climate in our broader statewide planning program. Thank you again for your time today. Please feel free to contact me by email later on if you have any questions, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. Bye.
Great. So that was Rebecca Lewis's presentation about climate change and land use and how HB 2488 can be supportive to addressing climate change as well within equity framework. So now we have a portion for Q&A. We have 10 more minutes. You can raise your hand or you can put it in the chat and we will answer any questions you might have as well. And we have Lisa Arkin, our Executive Director at Beyond Toxics as well here, and Jonathan can also help answer some questions from any of the land use perspectives that Professor Lewis might not be here to address. So one of the first questions we have, what groups are the primary opposition to HB 2488 and what are their arguments? And then what kinds of voices would be most effective in countering those arguments?
Thank you for that question. And I want to just say if any of the panelists want to chime in, we welcome that. At the moment, we've been, we meaning the team that's proponents of this bill, House Bill 2488, have been talking with a number of experts and interested parties. We actually have support from cities and counties for this bill. And I wouldn't call it opposition, but more about concern about resources to help smaller cities find the technical resources they need to implement House Bill 2488 for climate and equity. So as always, Oregon seems to face this unsolvable problem of how do we get the resources into communities so they can have the staff to implement, when they have to evaluate a application for a land use or zoning change, they need the staff to evaluate that. They need the staff to alert the community. They need the resources to put out the notifications. All those things take money. And so I wouldn't say we're getting pushback, but we're getting concerned about how do we get enough funding to really address climate in the way that House Bill 2488 would do so. Anyone else want to add to that from the panelists? All right, hope that helped.
I was talking and I realized my microphone was muted. Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, like you said, we haven't heard a lot of opposition yet. but we will definitely have some comments to be able to argue back for that.
All right, and there was a second part of that question. Sorry to interrupt you, about what kind of voices would be most effective in countering those arguments. Sorry, the dog is. I think voices from impacted communities will be needed and successful at countering arguments that this is not a place we should put resources. We have to make the case that this is a place we should put resources. And the business community is very important, because our bill does open up for economic development that is climate friendly, climate wise. So business community and business owners that champion climate would be the very best kind of strong voices from folks who have the investments to make in a climate smart community.
Thank you, Lisa. And then we had somebody who, I think it was Susanna Gladwin. They wanted to make a comment as a reviewer of the Clatsop County Comprehensive Plan Review Committee member. Are you still?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Maybe the question is related to when there's a public hearing. Can someone comment verbally? I'm not sure if that's the question, but yes, this legislature is welcoming both written comments that are submitted through their online system, as well as oral testimony during a hearing. And there's a whole complex way you do that. We have info sheets on the Beyond Toxics website that help you navigate that system. And if the question was really about part of this conversation, this webinar, I think Crystal or Anna could put in the chat some of our emails, and we'd be more than happy to talk with you.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. Somebody did put in the chat, Erin, do either of these allow for or prepare the way for a carbon tax?
I don't think this bill has anything to do directly with a carbon tax. No.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's okay. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. I know sometimes people need time to mull things over and digest information, and I know we threw a lot of information at you today as well. I'm gonna go ahead, Lisa.
There's a question in the chat from Anna Acuna. What about natural resources to create new materials for construction? This bill doesn't take a stand one way or the other on natural resources per se, but I would say that House Bill 2488 is friendly toward protecting natural resource land, because it asks cities and counties to really evaluate the ability of such land to sequester carbon, or to draw down greenhouse gases, or to create healthy foods or building materials. So again, it doesn't take a stand per se, but it encourages a local government to take those things into account prior to or before trying to rezone any kind of natural resource land for urban uses. And that's like a crux of the bill, that before land that is currently zoned as agriculture or forest land or mining land, whatever it might be, before those can be converted for residential or transportation, the climate change impacts or benefits must be considered. And as Jonathan said in his presentation, there has to be a factual basis presented in order to make a decision to convert land from natural resources to something else.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lisa. And we do have 4 more minutes. And we did get 2 more well, one's more like a comment than a question. And somebody said, what would be our advice to younger people and how we can think about how about they can support this legislation and how they can help promote and learn about equitable land use.
Amy, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Let's see. Advice to younger people on how we can think about. I don't know. I just, even me as a student, land use can be a pretty wonky topic. So definitely encouraging learning, holding events like these, doing like a land use one-on-one. I don't know how much land use is talked about in kind of like high school, middle school curriculum, but starting from there and getting students to think about the importance of land use and development decisions pretty early on, and their connections to climate and equity. And as far as supporting the legislation, I don't think there's any age restriction on giving public comment or writing letters. If you're wanting a more kind of like creative strategies, photos are always really effective means of communication, kind of like a photo narrative type of thing. So making it like a fun project, documenting instances of land use injustice in your community where they show up. So kind of using creative means as a political communication strategy.
Definitely. Thank you, Amy. Yeah, we will definitely be having, there's been a link shared in the chat to sign up for campaign updates. So definitely signing up that way. And we'll be sending out toolkits and on how to write an LTE, how to send an email to your legislator, action items that people can take to show support for this campaign and to sign up for. So that link has been shared. I think Crystal shared it again. To sign up for campaign updates and how people can support, especially folks who are younger and really interested in this. And I do want to end it with this one last question from Noel, a student. How would Goal 20 affect Black, Indigenous, people of color communities' ability to affect siting of pipelines and other fossil fuel infrastructure expansion?
I'd be happy to start with that. Our bill specifically requires local governments to not only consult with, for example, tribal communities or communities of color, but it also asks for local governments to have mutual concurrence with tribal communities. This is a new idea that tribal governments and communities have been talking about, this idea of concurrence, where people jointly make a decision rather than a decision being slapped on a community and a box. I think Amy said a box is checked, where, okay, we talk to them and we let them know we're building a pipeline, we're good to go. So this would require this kind of concurrence. It also will expand notification so that more communities of color, rural communities and disadvantaged communities will get notice prior to any kind of land use decision coming down the pike toward their community. Amy, did you want to add anything to that, or Jonathan?
No. Okay. Thank you. That was our last question. Thank you everybody for joining us and staying on as we're ending this small information session about SCR 17 and HB 2488. Please sign up for campaign updates as we will be sending out some communication toolkits to share with people who might be interested, or if you're an organization, to share with your followers. And yeah, sign up for our campaign updates to also learn about when we will have a hearing and to give testimony, when to email your legislator, and when to sign up for an upcoming lobby day for this legislation. So we really appreciate you taking the time to join us and learn a little bit more about these bills and their impacts. And we hope to see you in our upcoming legislature or as we move forward with these bills. Thank you. Have a good rest of your day, everybody.